There's a moment, and I need you to understand this before I tell you anything else. There's a moment where the entire galaxy holds its breath. Not metaphorically, not in the poetic sense that humans use when they're trying to sound profound. I mean literally. I mean that somewhere in the outer ring of the Velithari Conclave's diplomatic tier, 17 different species were physically incapable of breathing for a full 4 seconds because what they were watching simply did not make sense inside the logic of anything they had ever been taught about the universe. What they were watching was a single human. Standing. Not moving, not speaking, not blinking as far as anyone could tell. Just standing between a Velhari princess and the hand of a conclave enforcer that had actually decided, with the full backing of 3 centuries of galactic precedent, and the kind of institutional arrogance that only ever grows in places where nothing has ever pushed back, that touching her was acceptable. The enforcer's hand never made contact. That's the part they still argue about in the corridors of the Conclave's administrative complex on Valith Prime. Not the aftermath. Not the treaty renegotiations that took 11 months and cost the Conclave somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 billion credits in lost trade agreements. Not the formal apology that the Conclave's archdelegate had to deliver in person, in front of a full diplomatic assembly, to a species they had previously classified as a Tier 4 protected civilizational ward. They argue about the hand, about whether it stopped because of what the human said, or because of what the human looked like, or because of something else entirely, something in the posture, the stillness, the quality of attention that a Terran diplomatic guard projects when they have decided that a line is being crossed. My name is Oren Vask. I'm a Conclave historical archivist, retired, and I was in that corridor. I was 17 meters away, making notes on a datapad about the color of the diplomatic banners, because that is the kind of work that gets assigned to junior archivists on ceremonial rotation. And I watched all of it happen. This is my account of what occurred during the Velithari Terra Diplomatic Summit of Standard Year 4412. This is what actually happened, as opposed to what the Conclave's official record claims happened, which is a version so thoroughly sanitized that it barely qualifies as fiction. I'm writing this because I'm old now, and old people either take their secrets to whatever passes for a grave in their species, or they write them down. I've decided to write them down. You have to understand the context. You have to understand what the galaxy looked like in 4412 before any of this makes sense. Humanity had been part of the Galactic Conclave for approximately 60 standard years by that point. 60 years sounds like a long time, until you understand that the Velithari Conclave itself was over 3,000 years old, and that most of its member species had been participating in interspecies diplomacy for at least 1,000 years before the humans ever made first contact with a Conclave survey vessel, somewhere near the edge of what the Conclave called the Solari Rim. The humans called it the Milky Way, the Conclave called it a backwater. Not officially. Officially, the Conclave used careful, bureaucratic language that technically said nothing negative about any member species' point of origin. But there is a thing that happens in large bureaucratic structures. The Conclave was one of the largest in the known galaxy, where the official language and the actual culture diverge so completely that you end up with 2 entirely separate realities operating simultaneously. The official reality, in which all species were equal members of a thriving multi-species community, and the actual reality, in which there was an extremely well-understood hierarchy, and humans were somewhere near the bottom of it. The classification system told you everything you needed to know about how the Conclave actually thought about things. Tier 1 species were the founders, the 6 species that had originally established the Conclave and whose political and economic interests essentially ran everything. The Velithari were Tier 1. The Kethra were Tier 1. The Solendi Collective, the Murath Dominion, the Felari Syndicate, the Voy, all Tier 1. Tier 2 were the established members, old enough, large enough, and diplomatically sophisticated enough to have earned a meaningful seat at various tables. They had voting rights on most things. They were consulted rather than simply informed. Tier 3 were the newer members, technically equal, practically junior. They had voting rights on paper. In practice, their votes were most useful when you needed to demonstrate that a decision had broad support. Tier 4 was where it got complicated. Tier 4 was technically called the Protected Civilizational Ward Classification, which was a name that the Conclave's founders had apparently thought sounded protective and caring. What it actually meant was, your species has made first contact, you are not considered a threat, and we will manage your integration into galactic civilization on our timeline according to our standards, because we have determined that you are not yet ready to participate as a full member. Tier 4 species did not have voting rights. They had observation seats at selected diplomatic assemblies. They had access to a curated portion of the Conclave's technological database. They had a liaison office and a case manager. Humanity had entered the Conclave as a Tier 4 species. They had been reclassified to Tier 3 at the 40-year mark, which the Conclave's official record described as an unusually rapid progression. At the 55-year mark, there had been a motion to begin the review process for potential Tier 2 classification. That motion had been tabled 3 times in 5 years, primarily by the Veilithari delegation. By 4412, humanity was firmly Tier 3, trending upward in theory, in practice going nowhere because several Tier 1 species had quietly decided that the pace of human integration was moving faster than they were comfortable with. The Terra Veilithar Summit was supposed to be a step toward changing that. A formal diplomatic summit between a Tier 3 species and one of the founder species was a significant thing. It meant the founders were willing to engage as near equals. It meant there was something real on the table. What was on the table, specifically, was a trade route. The Veilithari controlled access to the Velhari Corridor, a navigational pathway through a dense stellar region that cut transit times between the inner conclave worlds and the outer rim by roughly 40%. Humanity had been routing around the corridor for 60 years, adding weeks to every trade run, every resupply mission, every piece of communication that needed to travel the hard way. Access to the Velhari Corridor would have been transformative. The Veilithari knew this, which is why the summit had been 5 years in the negotiation before it even started. The Veilithari delegation that arrived on the neutral station of Arhan's Point, chosen as the summit location specifically because it was one of the few places in this region of space that was genuinely administered by a third party, the Arhenian merchant guilds, who had zero interest in either side's politics as long as transit fees were being paid, was led by a woman named Velhari, Sovereign Delegate Siraketh Veilith. And she had brought her daughter with her. The daughter's name was Veilith Myrasol Keth. She was 23 standard years old, which, in Veilithari terms, made her young but not a child. The Veilithari aged slowly in human terms. They lived for roughly 400 standard years, and Myrasol at 23 was something like a teenager in the middle of her first serious education. She was studying diplomatic methodology. The summit was considered an educational experience. In every account I've read, in everything I saw myself, Myrasol was quiet, watchful, and serious in the way of someone who is used to being in rooms where important things happen and has learned to observe rather than participate. She sat at the periphery of meetings. She made notes. She didn't involve herself in the actual negotiations. She was not there as a negotiating party. She was there as a student. The human delegation was led by a man named Ambassador Darian Cole. I remember him as a tall, thin man with the kind of calm that takes decades to grow, The calm of someone who has been in enough high-stakes rooms that he no longer confuses nervousness for readiness. He was 61 standard years old. He had spent the previous 15 years working specifically toward this summit. He brought a team of 12 negotiators, analysts, cultural specialists, and communications officers. And he brought 3 Terran diplomatic guards. The Terran diplomatic guard was not old, as institutions go. It had been established 30 years earlier, during the period after what historians call the Porthos Station incident. A story I could tell for an entire document on its own, but the short version is that a Tier 3 human diplomatic team in the outer systems had been surrounded, threatened, and ultimately physically detained by a group of conclave enforcement officers acting on behalf of a Tier 1 species' economic interests. And nobody in the conclave's official structure had done anything about it for 11 months. 11 months. A human diplomatic team detained in a station cell with inadequate food and no communication access for 11 months. When they were finally released, through a combination of quiet pressure from the Arhenian guilds and a surprisingly sharp public statement from the Voi founders, the Voi had their own complicated relationship with the Veilithari. The humans went home, and they had a very long conversation about what had just happened and what it meant. The conclusion of that conversation was that nobody was going to protect humanity in the conclave spaces, except humanity itself. The Terran diplomatic guard was the result. Now, I want to be precise about what the guard was and was not. The guard was not a military force. They did not carry offensive weapons on diplomatic stations. They did not have authority to take actions that would violate the laws of whatever jurisdiction they were operating in. They had no more legal power than a civilian in most of the spaces they worked in. What they had instead was presence, training, a very specific kind of attention to their environment that I had never seen in any other species' diplomatic protection service. And they had a code. Every species in the conclave that used protective personnel had some version of a code. The Veilithari conclave enforcers had the 7 obligations. The Kethra Security Corps had the 30 principles. The Felari Syndicate's private protective services had what they called the protocol, which was rumored to be several hundred pages long, and which no one outside the syndicate had ever actually seen. The Terran Diplomatic Guards Code was 11 words. I know the exact words because they were eventually entered into the conclave's formal record as part of the aftermath of the summit. 11 words, and the way they were arranged was considered so direct and so unambiguous by the species that eventually read them that it became something of a point of discussion among diplomatic historians. The 11 words were, "The people in our care do not get touched by anyone." That was it. That was the whole code, or at least the distillation of it. There was a longer document, a training manual, a set of protocols. But 11 words was what the guard had reportedly reduced it to when someone asked what the core principle was. The person who reportedly said it first was the guard's founding director, a woman named Commander Alice Okafor, who had been on the Porthos Station diplomatic team. She had been detained for 11 months. She wrote 11 words. I've always found that significant. The 3 guards that Ambassador Cole brought to Arhan's Point were Senior Guard Juno Vassar, Guard 2nd Class Tobias Wren, and Guard 3rd Class Alina Cove. Vassar was the one that mattered in the end. She was the one in the corridor. I saw her when the delegation arrived. I was there in the diplomatic arrival atrium because it was my job to document arrivals, the banners, the formal greetings, the exchange of credentials. I noticed her the way you notice something that doesn't quite fit the pattern of everything else in the frame. The human delegation was dressed in what I would describe as formal but not ceremonial attire, deep blue, clean lines, nothing ornamental. Vassar was dressed the same way, but she moved differently from the diplomats around her. She moved the way a sensor array scans a room, which is to say continuously, systematically, and without any performance of doing so. She wasn't obviously looking around. She was just aware of everything. She was young, 30 perhaps by human reckoning, which made her very young indeed by the standards of most species in the conclave. The Veilithari conclave enforcers didn't consider their people fully experienced until they'd served for a century. 30 seemed almost absurdly young for protective work of this significance. I remember thinking that. I remember watching Vassar scan the atrium and thinking, they sent children to protect their ambassador. I remember being wrong about that. The summit ran for 4 days before the corridor incident. The negotiations, from what I gathered from my peripheral position, I was not in the rooms, I was documenting the spaces around the rooms, were going better than expected. Cole was a skilled negotiator, and the Veilithari delegation, despite carrying the weight of 3 centuries of founder superiority, seemed genuinely interested in a deal. The Velhari corridor was an asset, but maintaining it required resources, and the Veilithari had been quietly dealing with infrastructure challenges for the past decade. Human engineering firms had a reputation, even in 4412, for being fast and practical in ways that made other species uncomfortable. A trade agreement that included infrastructure partnership wasn't just about transit fees. It was about solving a problem the Veilithari had, but didn't like to admit having. Myrasol attended some of the sessions. Not as a participant, she was always seated away from the table, always with her datapad, always watching. A few times I was in position to observe through a secondary corridor window, and I saw her making notes with an intensity that reminded me of the best archivists I'd known. The ones who understood that what you capture in the moment is always cleaner than what you reconstruct from memory afterward. On the evening of the 3rd day, there was a formal reception. These are common in diplomatic summits of this kind. A social event, less structured than a negotiating session, designed to give the delegations a chance to interact in a more relaxed context. The theory being that relationships built in informal settings support the formal work in the rooms. I was at the reception in my archivist capacity, documenting. There were representatives from several other conclave species present as observers, the Merchant Guild's senior administrators, a few Tier 2 delegations who had interests in the outcome, some members of the conclave's official diplomatic oversight corps. It was a moderately crowded room for a station of Arhan's Point size. Vassar was there. All 3 guards were present, distributed through the room in what I recognized afterward as a deliberate positioning pattern. Ren was near the main entrance. Cove was near the refreshment areas, which were always the highest traffic zones. Vassar was close to Ambassador Cole, but not attached to him. There were about 5 meters of space between them, and she moved with that space rather than closing it. I watched her at the reception because by that point I'd been watching her for 3 days, and she was the most interesting person in any room she occupied, in the way that interesting here meant something different from charismatic. She wasn't drawing attention to herself. She was absorbing it somehow, taking in everything around her, and returning nothing that gave away the quality of her attention. At some point during the reception, I noticed that Myrasol had been approached by a group of the Conclave Oversight Delegation, 3 individuals from the Kethra member species. They were making conversation. Nothing unusual, young members of senior delegations were often approached by established conclave figures. It was a networking function in its way. They asked her questions. She answered. She was clearly slightly uncomfortable. The Kethra were not known for their sensitivity to personal space by other species standards, but she was managing it. What I noticed, and I am certain I noticed this because it is one of those images that stayed perfectly intact in my memory for 50 years afterward, was that Vassar, from across the room, noticed the same discomfort. Her head didn't turn toward Myrasol. Nothing about her physical orientation changed, but something shifted in her attention that I can only describe as a kind of brightening of focus, the way a scanner's resolution increases when it detects a pattern worth investigating. She didn't move. Nothing happened. The Kethra finished their conversation with Myrasol and moved on. Myrasol relaxed incrementally. Vassar's focus, whatever I had perceived of it, returned to its baseline. I wrote it down in my notes as, Human Guard appears to maintain situational awareness of all delegation-adjacent persons simultaneously. Noteworthy. That was the evening of the third day. The corridor incident was midday on the fourth. Let me tell you about Conclave Enforcer, second rank Orathsel Vun. I've thought about him many times over the years. History doesn't treat him well, and in strict terms of what he did and why and what it caused, it probably shouldn't. But I've been an archivist for a long time, and archivists, if they're any good at their jobs, try to understand the interior logic of events. Not excuse them, understand them. Orathsel Vun was a career enforcer with 22 years of service. He had worked almost exclusively in the diplomatic tier, which was considered a prestigious assignment. He had been trained in what the Conclave called civilizational hierarchy protocols, the set of rules governing how Conclave personnel interacted with species of different tier classifications. The civilizational hierarchy protocols were, and I am being as objective as I can hear bad. They were a formalization of the Conclave's hierarchical bias dressed in the language of procedure. The core idea was that Conclave personnel representing Tier 1 or Tier 2 interests had certain operational authorities when interacting with Tier 3 and Tier 4 species. These authorities were justified on paper by the language of civilizational mentorship and graduated integration support. In practice, what they meant was that a Conclave enforcer could, under certain circumstances, physically redirect, physically detain, and physically compel a member of a Tier 3 or Tier 4 species if they determined it was necessary for the orderly conduct of whatever diplomatic function was underway. The threshold for necessary was extremely loose. It had never been seriously challenged, because no Tier 3 or Tier 4 species had ever had the combination of standing, resources, and documentation to challenge it. Vun had used these authorities before. Not abusively, I don't want to paint him as a monster. He had used them procedurally, in the way that someone uses a tool they've been trained to use and have used many times without consequence. He understood them to be legitimate. He had never had reason to believe otherwise. On the fourth day of the summit, there was a complication in the scheduling. A secondary negotiating session had been scheduled for one of the mid-tier conference rooms at the same time as a maintenance window that the station's engineering systems had flagged as mandatory. The result was a reshuffling of where people needed to be at what time, and for about 40 minutes in the middle of the day, the normal flow of movement through the station's diplomatic corridor was somewhat chaotic. Myrasol was, for reasons that I honestly cannot fully reconstruct, the accounts I've gathered are inconsistent on this point, in the corridor outside the Veilithari delegation's primary conference room without her usual attendants. She may have stepped out for a moment. She may have been waiting for someone who hadn't arrived yet. The exact reason is one of those small human-scale details that large events tend to swallow. Vun was in the corridor as part of his standard patrol rotation. He recognized her as a junior member of the Veilithari delegation, and this is the critical thing, the thing that reveals how completely he had internalized the civilizational hierarchy protocols. He also recognized that she was standing in a zone that was, per the revised schedule, technically cleared for maintenance access. He had been specifically briefed to ensure the corridor was cleared. He had authority, under the protocols, to physically redirect a Tier 3 member if they were impeding operational requirements. He had not registered that Myrasol was Veilithari, or rather, and this is subtle, and this is the part that the Conclave's official record deliberately obscured, he had registered it, but in a way that had been filtered through assumptions. She was young. She was without her senior delegation members. She was in a place that was mildly inconvenient. The filter, the 22-year career filter that had trained him to see Tier 3 and below as manageable in ways that Tier 1 was not, had apparently, and I am speculating here, but I am speculating based on 50 years of thinking about this, simply not fired the correct flags in the order it should have. He approached her. He said something, different accounts give different words, and I was not close enough to hear. He reached for her arm. To redirect her. That was the intent. Move her out of the corridor quickly and efficiently and get back to his patrol. 20 seconds. He had done it before. The hand never made contact. Let me tell you what I saw. I was 17 meters down the corridor, as I said. I had walked out of a side archival access room with my datapad because I'd been sent to document the new maintenance equipment that had been staged in the corridor. The equipment was large, functional, and very boring, and I was half focused on it and half focused on composing in my head the least dull way to describe industrial maintenance staging in a formal archive record. I noticed Myrasol because I'd been paying attention to her for 4 days. I noticed Vun because conclave enforcers move with a particular kind of authority that you learn to track when you work in diplomatic spaces. It's a slightly too deliberate walk, a walk that says I have reasons to be exactly where I am and I know exactly what those reasons are. I noticed that they were in the same space at the same moment, and that the interaction had the beginning texture of the kind of interaction that you document very carefully when you're an archivist. Because interactions in diplomatic corridors between enforcers and delegation members sometimes become significant later. I raised my datapad. And then I noticed the fourth person. Vassar had come from somewhere. I genuinely cannot tell you where. She wasn't visible in the corridor the moment before, and then she was, and the only explanation I've been able to construct is that there was a secondary entrance alcove about 8 meters from Myrasol's position, and Vassar had been in or near it. Guard positioning protocols, I learned later, included something called shadow presence maintenance, keeping a guard in or near the periphery of any space that a protected person might occupy. It wasn't following. It was being positioned in advance of where someone might be. Whether she had been there for 30 seconds or 5 minutes, I don't know. What I know is that when Vun's hand moved toward Myrasol's arm, Vassar was already between them. I don't know how to describe the movement precisely. It wasn't fast in the way that combat moves are fast, the way that violence moves, with acceleration and impact. It was more like a door closing. One moment there was a gap between Vun's hand and Myrasol's arm, and the next moment Vassar occupied that gap. Not blocking with her body exactly, standing in the space, making the gap unavailable by being in it. Vun stopped. He stopped, I think, primarily because he almost walked into her. She was simply there when she hadn't been there an instant before, and even trained enforcers operate on reflexes that say you don't walk through a person without first registering that there is a person. He stopped and he looked at her, and I watched his face go through several things in rapid sequence. The first thing was surprise, pure and uncomplicated. The second thing was recognition, registering that she was wearing the blue of the Terran delegation, that she was human, that she was a guard. The third thing was the thing I've thought about the most. It was something between reassessment and recalibration. He looked at her the way you look at something when you've categorized it one way, and then new information forces you to reconsider whether you categorized it correctly. Vassar said something. I couldn't hear the words. The corridor wasn't silent. There were maintenance sounds, distant voices, the ambient hum of the station systems, and 17 meters is far enough that quiet speech doesn't carry. But I could see her speaking. 2 sentences, maybe 3, short. She wasn't elaborating. She wasn't explaining herself. Vun said something back. Vassar said something else. Vun said something else. Then there were about 4 seconds where neither of them spoke. 4 seconds of absolutely still, completely silent, total mutual attention that felt, from 17 meters away through a slightly fogged corridor window, like something that weighed considerably more than silence should weigh. Then Vun stepped back. He didn't leave immediately. He stood there for another moment, looking at Vassar, looking at Myrasol, and then he straightened in a way that looked like a decision rather than a physical movement. And then he walked away, back the direction he'd come from. Vassar watched him until he was around the corridor bend. Then she turned to Myrasol and said something. Brief. Whatever it was, Myrasol responded, nodded, said something back, and a moment later the two of them walked together toward the Velithari conference room. I stood in the corridor for a moment. Then I wrote 2 things in my notes. The first, Terran guard intervened in enforcer approach to Velithari junior delegate. Intervention resolved without incident. Duration approximately 90 seconds. The second, what did she say to him? It took me 3 days to find out. Partly because asking Vassar directly didn't seem like something she would welcome, and partly because there had been a development that made the question feel significantly more urgent. Vun had filed a formal complaint. The complaint, which I obtained access to through archival channels some months after the summit, described the incident as unauthorized interference with conclave enforcement operations by Terran diplomatic guard personnel. It claimed that Vassar had physically obstructed a lawful operational directive. It requested a formal review under the civilizational hierarchy protocols. It also, and this is the part that I think set in motion what happened next, characterized Myrasol as a Tier 3 delegation member in an unauthorized zone. Myrasol was Velithari. She was Tier 1. She was the daughter of the sovereign delegate who was the senior representative of one of the conclave's founder species. The complaint was filed at a clerical level. It took 12 hours to reach someone in the conclave administrative structure who understood what it said. When it did reach that person, the person immediately went to their supervisor. Their supervisor went to their supervisor. The chain moved very quickly in the direction of the conclave archdelegate's office. The archdelegate at the time was a Kethra named Velorath Sen. Sen had been in his position for 40 years and was, by all accounts, extremely experienced and extremely careful. He understood the situation immediately. He also understood that Vun's complaint by misclassifying Myrasol had created the kind of administrative record that, if it remained unaddressed, would eventually surface in ways the conclave did not want it to surface. He moved to address it quietly. He pulled the complaint from the review process. He arranged for Vun to be quietly reassigned. He also, and I believe this was a mistake born of the same institutional arrogance that had produced the civilizational hierarchy protocols in the first place, decided that the resolution should not involve any formal acknowledgement to the Terran delegation that an incident had occurred. He didn't inform Ambassador Cole. He didn't inform Sovereign Delegate Valeth. He definitely didn't inform Myrasol. This was, I understand with the benefit of 50 years of hindsight, the moment where the cost was incurred, not the corridor. The corridors was the incident. The bureaucratic decision not to acknowledge it was the debt. Everything that came after was the payment. What Sen didn't know, couldn't have known, because it wasn't yet publicly documented, was that the Terran diplomatic guard had their own protocols for incidents. Vassar had filed a report within 40 minutes of the corridor event, standard procedure. The report went to Guard Command, who assessed it. Within 6 hours of the original incident, Ambassador Cole had been fully briefed. Within 12 hours, the briefing had been transmitted back to Terra. The humans knew exactly what had happened. They also knew, very quickly, that the conclave was not going to acknowledge it. I learned much later what Cole said when he received the briefing. He was apparently quiet for a moment after reading the report, and then he said something to his senior negotiator that the senior negotiator later described to me as, "Make a note of it, all of it. We're going to need it." Cole didn't say anything to the Vale delegation the next day. He didn't raise the incident in negotiations. The summit concluded on schedule. The preliminary framework agreement on the Valhari corridor was signed. Everything looked from the outside completely normal. It was anything but. I need to tell you what Vassar actually said to Vun, because I found out, and it matters. I found it eventually through a combination of sources. A partial audio record from the station's maintenance sensors that had been recording ambient sound for diagnostic purposes. A deposition that Vun gave during the internal conclave review process that he was not supposed to know I had access to. And a brief conversation I had, 7 months after the summit, with Vassar herself when she was briefly stationed at a conclave administrative hub where I was doing long-term archival work. She didn't give me a lot. She wasn't the kind of person who gave a lot. But when I asked her, carefully, indirectly, in the way of someone who has spent 40 years figuring out how to ask questions without making people feel interrogated, she confirmed the substance of what I had pieced together. The first thing she said to Vun when she stepped into the space and stopped him was, "Don't." Just that one word. Vun, according to his own account, said something to the effect of, "This is an authorized operational directive under the hierarchy protocols. Please stand aside." Vassar said, "She's in our care. That means she doesn't get touched by anyone." Vun said something about the protocols, about his authority, about Tier 3 operational management. Vassar said, "She's Tier 1. There was a pause. Vun, according to his account, said, "She is a junior delegate without senior escort in a cleared corridor. The protocols authorize." And Vassar interrupted him, which was notable because she had apparently not interrupted him before that point, and she said, quietly and without heat, "I know what the protocols say. I also know who she is. And I know that the hand you almost put on her arm belongs to someone who works for an institution that detained 11 humans for 11 months in a station cell, and then told the galaxy nothing happened. So I'm going to need you to hear me very clearly when I say, don't." That's when the 4 seconds happened, the 4 seconds of silence. Vun stepped back. Vassar told me, in our conversation 7 months later, that she had not been angry. I asked her about it because I wanted to understand the quality of those 4 seconds, and she said, "I wasn't angry. I was clear. There's a difference. Anger makes you imprecise. Clear is just clear." She said, "The protocols give him authority over a Tier 3 member. She wasn't Tier 3, but even if she had been a Tier 3 delegate, alone in a corridor, exactly the way he thought she was, the answer was still don't. Because the people in our care don't get touched. That's not a negotiating position. That's just how it is." I asked her if she had been worried about the consequences. Filing your body between a conclave enforcer and his intended action had never, as far as I knew, been done before by a Terran guard. She looked at me for a moment. "Consequences for who?" she said. I didn't have a good answer to that. The conclave found out that the humans knew about 6 weeks after the summit concluded, when the preliminary framework agreement was submitted for formal conclave ratification. The humans had submitted it, and this is the part that made the archdelegate's office go very quiet for about a day, with an addendum. The addendum was 18 pages. It was called, in the formal diplomatic language of the submission, a supplemental protocol clarification regarding the safety and status of all Terran-adjacent persons operating in conclave-administered spaces. It referenced the corridor incident directly. It referenced the misclassification of Valith Myrasol Keth in the enforcer's complaint. It referenced the 11 months of Porthos Station. It referenced the civilizational hierarchy protocols in full, with specific sections highlighted and annotated. And it stated, clearly and without the careful diplomatic softening that most Tier 3 species used when addressing Tier 1 concerns, that Terra would not ratify the preliminary framework agreement without formal revision of the civilizational hierarchy protocols to remove the authority of conclave enforcement personnel to physically direct any delegation member of any species without explicit consent. Any species, not just Tier 3, not just humans, any species. The last section of the addendum said, Terra understands that this request is unusual. Terra also understands that unusual requests require unusual reasons. We have provided the reasons. We are prepared to provide more. The Archdelegate's office, from what I eventually gathered from sources I am not going to name in this document, was not pleased. The Velithari sovereign delegate, however, was. Because sovereign delegate Siraketh Velith had not been briefed about the corridor incident either. She had not known that Vun had approached her daughter. She had not known that her daughter had been misclassified in an official complaint as Tier 3. She had not known that the Archdelegate's office had quietly processed and suppressed that complaint without informing the senior Velithari delegate, that the daughter of the senior Velithari delegate had been incorrectly categorized in a conclave administrative document. She found out when the addendum landed on her desk. By all accounts, she read it once. Then she put it down. Then she went to find Archdelegate Sen. I was not present for that conversation. No one I know was present for that conversation. But the results of it were visible in the way that earthquakes are visible after they've happened. You see the landscape that's changed rather than the force that changed it. The formal conclave response to the addendum took 11 months. 11 months, the same number as Porthos Station. I don't know if Cole did that intentionally or if it was coincidence, but I've always found it significant. There's a certain quality to people who understand symbolism, who understand that numbers carry weight in institutional memory. Cole was one of those people. I think the 11 months was entirely intentional. During those 11 months, the Velhari Corridor Framework was officially in suspension, technically pending ratification. The transit fees stopped flowing. The infrastructure partnership discussions stopped. Everything stopped. The Velithari took the hardest hit. They had been relying on the framework more than they had publicly acknowledged. The infrastructure challenges I mentioned, they were real, and they were getting worse. And the partnership with human engineering firms had been part of the sovereign delegate's strategy for addressing them through a back channel that didn't require publicly admitting weakness to the rest of the conclave. All of that was on ice. For 11 months. The conclave's diplomatic apparatus tried various approaches to move the situation forward without formally conceding the addendum's demands. They sent envoys. They suggested alternative language. They proposed review committees. Cole's team received all of it politely, engaged with it constructively, and then came back each time to the same point. The addendum language, unchanged, was the condition for ratification. Sovereign Delegate Velith did not publicly support the addendum. She didn't need to. Her private communications with the Archdelegate's office, which I did not see but whose existence and general tenor were widely understood within the administrative structure, were apparently sufficient to make the conclave's calculus quite clear. The founder whose territory the corridor ran through was not going to oppose the revision. Without Velithari opposition, the Tier 1 bloc could not hold together. Without a unified Tier 1 bloc, the protocol's revision was not the political impossibility it had initially appeared. At month 9, Archdelegate Sen retired, officially for health reasons. He was replaced by an interim archdelegate named Velsari Kath, who was younger, and who had a reputation for what the conclave described as practical modernism, which meant she was willing to make the calculation that a system that created incidents like the corridor incident was a system that was going to keep creating incidents like the corridor incident, and that the cost of the next incident might be higher than the cost of the revision. At month 11, the civilizational hierarchy protocols were formally revised. The physical direction authority was removed. A new framework for conclave enforcement interaction with delegation members of any species was adopted that required explicit voluntary consent for any physical contact. The Velhari Corridor Framework was ratified 2 weeks later. I attended the ratification ceremony as an archivist. My job was to document it. The banners, the formal exchange, the signatures. Cole shook hands with Sovereign Delegate Valeth. They exchanged the standard diplomatic acknowledgments. They said the things that people say at the end of long negotiations that have finally resolved. Then, at the edge of the ceremony space, I saw something that I didn't write in the official archive record, because it wasn't part of the formal event. Myra Saul was there. She'd come to the ratification as an observer, same as she'd come to the summit sessions. She was standing near the periphery with her datapad. And Vassar was there. Not in the ceremony space. The guards weren't part of the formal ceremony, but in the corridor adjacent, doing what guards do, being present in a way that doesn't call attention to itself. Myra Saul walked toward the corridor exit at the end of the ceremony. She passed within a few meters of Vassar. She stopped. They exchanged what appeared to be a brief conversation. 2 sentences each, maybe. Something that took about 30 seconds. I couldn't hear it. Myra Saul nodded once, in what appeared to be a gesture of acknowledgement or respect. Then she walked on. I wrote it in my personal notes, not my official archive record. They spoke. The princess and the guard spoke. I don't know what was said. I think it might have been the most important conversation of the entire 11 months. I looked for Vassar again after, over the years. I never served in a place where she was stationed again, but I tracked her career through the institutional records I had access to as an archivist. She rose through the Terran diplomatic guards ranks steadily. Not meteoric, she wasn't the type that had anything meteoric about her, in the sense of drawing attention to herself. Steady, competent, the kind of career that builds authority through a long string of situations handled correctly. She eventually became commander of the guard, the second person to hold that title after Alice Okafor. She revised the guard's 11-word code, or rather she expanded it. The new version was longer, I've read it. The core remained the same. The people in our care do not get touched by anyone. But she added something after it. She added, and in doing so, we do not hurt them. We do not help them by making them smaller. We help them by making the space around them safe enough that they can be exactly as large as they need to be. I've thought about that addition a lot. I think she was thinking about Myra Saul when she wrote it. I think she was thinking about what it means to protect someone who doesn't see themselves as needing protection, who is in a space where the systems around them have decided they're smaller than they are, and what the right kind of protection looks like in that situation. Not making a show of it, not escalating, not performing strength. Just standing in the space, saying don't, meaning it. Walking away afterward, and letting the person who needed the space be in it. The conclave, after the protocol revision, went through what the diplomatic histories I've read call a period of structural modernization, which is a very clean way of saying a lot of things that had calcified over 3 centuries of hierarchical thinking had to be slowly and sometimes painfully reconsidered. The tier classification system wasn't abolished. It still exists in a modified form today, but the operational authorities attached to higher tier status were significantly curtailed. Humanity reached Tier 2 classification 6 years after the ratification. The review that had been tabled 3 times in 5 years was completed in 18 months after the protocol revision, because the political calculus had shifted in ways that the review committee found they could not ignore. I've heard it argued sometimes that humanity played the conclave, that the whole summit was a setup, that Cole knew exactly what he was doing, that the Velhari corridor negotiation was always going to be leverage rather than just a trade deal. I've heard it argued that the Porthos Station incident was held in reserve for decades specifically, so it could be deployed at a moment of maximum leverage. I don't believe that. Or rather, I believe that Cole understood the value of documentation, understood that the Porthos Station incident was a debt the Conclave owed and had never paid, and understood that a moment would eventually come when the payment could be requested. I believe he was ready when the moment came. I don't believe he manufactured the moment. The corridor was not manufactured. Vun made his own decision. The bureaucratic impulse to suppress rather than acknowledge made its own decision. These were not things Cole controlled. The only thing anyone controlled was what they did when the moment arrived. Vassar controlled where she stood. That was it. That was the whole thing, where she stood. And where she stood cost an empire everything it thought the protocols had guaranteed it. The comfortable authority of a system that had decided some people were small enough to be redirected without asking. I'm old now. I said that at the beginning. 87 standard years, which for my species is moderately old but not ancient. I've spent most of those years in archival work, documenting things, trying to capture events accurately enough that whoever reads the record 50 years later has something real to work with. The Conclave's official record of the Velithari Terra Summit of standard year 4412 is, as I said at the beginning of this document, thoroughly sanitized. It records the successful negotiation of the Velhari Corridor framework. It records the protocol revision as a separate administrative matter arising from internal review. It does not connect the two. It does not mention Vun's complaint. It does not mention the addendum. It does not mention Vassar. I'm writing this because I was there, and because I have the notes, and because Vassar deserves to be in the record. Not for heroism. I want to be careful about that word. What she did wasn't heroic in the sense that heroism is usually meant. The big, visible, kinetic thing. The act that rewrites the room in an instant. What she did was smaller than that and more durable. She stood in the space. She said 2 words. She meant them. She filed a report within 40 minutes. The rest followed, the way that things follow when they've been held in place by inertia for a very long time, and suddenly something breaks the inertia. Not because the thing that broke it was large, because the inertia was tired. The protocols had been in place for 300 years. 300 years of a galaxy telling itself that some people were small enough to be redirected without asking. 300 years of that idea accumulating in the bodies of enforcers who had never had any reason to question it. And then one person stood in the space and said, "Don't." One more thing. 7 months after the summit, when I spoke briefly with Vassar at the administrative hub where we were both briefly stationed, she passing through, me based there, I asked her the question I'd been holding since the corridor. I asked her if she had been afraid, not of Vun, of what came after, of the complaint, of the possibility that she had, by standing in that space, created a diplomatic incident that would be resolved against the humans and might set back Terra's standing in the conclave rather than advancing it. She looked at me with the same quality of attention I'd noticed in the atrium on the first day. Direct, unhurried, like she had already considered everything she needed to consider before the question was finished. "The people in my care don't get touched," she said. "That's not a calculation. It's not a decision I weigh against other factors. It just is." I said, "But if it had gone wrong?" "It didn't go wrong," she said. "But if..." She almost smiled, not quite, something close. "The moment I stopped asking that question," she said, "was the moment I understood the job." She picked up her kit bag and walked toward the departure terminal. I stood there in the corridor and thought about 11 words. I thought about a hand that never touched what it reached for. I thought about 4 seconds of silence in a diplomatic corridor, and what those 4 seconds eventually cost an empire. I've been thinking about it ever since.